Picture a man standing at an iron gate on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The paint is peeling off the bars. The hinges are rusted the color of dried blood. The lane beyond it is buried under years of fallen leaves that nobody ever raked, because nobody was ever supposed to come back here. And yet here he is. Richard Harlan Voss, 71 years old, one of the most powerful men in the northeastern United States. Standing at the entrance of the home he built with his own hands, a home he swore, on the worst day of his life, he would never enter again. He wasn't supposed to be here. His driver had taken a back road to avoid the construction on Route 9, and the estate appeared through the passenger window before Richard even realized where they were. He told the driver to stop. He got out of the car. He stood there for a long moment, breathing in the cold air, looking at the place where his family had once lived and laughed and fought and loved. The place where his son Daniel had grown up. The place Richard had sealed off and tried to forget 6 years ago, when Daniel died. He saw the silhouette first. Second floor, east wing, the room that used to belong to Daniel. The window was dirty, half fogged with years of condensation and grime, but through it, unmistakably, there was a shadow. And the shadow moved. And in the space of one heartbeat, Richard Harlan Voss felt something happen inside his chest that he had not felt since the day he learned his son was gone. He felt the floor of his entire understanding of the world drop out from beneath him. That shadow was not a trick of light. It was not a squatter. It was not a burglar. It was his son, his dead son, his mourned and grieved and memorial service-attended son, standing in the window of the Voss Estate on a Tuesday afternoon in October 2024, alive. 6 years after the world was told, he had taken his own life and disappeared into the cold waters of the Hudson River. 6 years of grief, 6 years of guilt, 6 years of a closed chapter, blown open in a single moment by a figure in a dirty window. This is the story of what it means to lose someone, and then discover that the loss was never what you were told it was. This is the story of a father and a son and the empire that stood between them. This is the story of the secrets that powerful men keep, and the heavier secrets that their children are forced to carry. And this is the story of 6 years of silence inside the walls of an abandoned home, and the autumn afternoon when that silence finally broke. Stay with us, because what you are about to hear will not let you go. Before we go any further, let's make sure we understand the full weight of what we're dealing with here, because the easy version of this story is not the true version. The easy version says a young man faked his death to escape something, hid in an old house for 6 years, and was eventually found by his father. That version is technically accurate, but it leaves out everything that actually matters. It leaves out why. It leaves out who knew what and when they knew it. And it leaves out the most troubling question of all, a question that Richard Voss himself has never fully answered in public, and that the people who know him best still argue about to this day. So here are the 3 questions that are going to drive everything you watch in this documentary. The first question: did Daniel Voss make the decision to disappear entirely on his own, or was he pushed? The second question: in the 6 years that Daniel was living inside the walls of his father's estate, hidden from the world, how much did Richard Voss actually know? And the third question, the one that cuts deepest: if Richard knew his son was alive and chose not to come forward, was that an act of love, an act of cowardice, or something far more calculated than either of those? We will get to all 3 of those answers before this video ends, but the answers, I promise you, will raise more questions than they settle, because this story does not resolve neatly, It does not end with a verdict or a press conference or a family reunion where everyone smiles for the cameras. It ends the way real life ends for people who have spent years carrying unbearable weight, quietly, incompletely, and with a handful of things that will never fully be said. Before we dive deeper into this story, we want to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let us go back to the beginning, because to understand what happened in that window, you have to understand what happened long before the gate rusted and the leaves piled up and the estate fell silent. Richard Harlan Voss was not born into money. He was born into something harder, the particular kind of American determination that comes from watching your father work himself to an early grave and deciding, with all the conviction a 12-year-old can muster, that that will not be your story. His father, Gerald Voss, was a steelworker in Allentown, Pennsylvania, who clocked in before sunrise 6 days a week and came home too tired to say much of anything. He died of a heart attack at 54. Richard was 19. He had already been working construction jobs for 2 summers, saving every dollar in a coffee can under his bed, and the morning after his father's funeral, he went back to work. Not because he had no choice, because he had made one. By the time Richard was 30, he had started his own small contracting firm out of a rented office above a dry cleaner in eastern Pennsylvania. By 35, he had his first major commercial contract, a warehouse complex outside of Harrisburg. By 40, his company, Voss Construction and Development, had offices in 3 states and a reputation that made developers call him before they called anyone else. He was known for 2 things equally: getting things built on time and getting things built his way. He did not negotiate from weakness. He did not apologize for his ambitions, and he did not, under any circumstances, discuss his personal life with anyone who did not absolutely need to know. Richard married Margaret Calloway in 1979. She was a schoolteacher from western New Jersey who had met Richard at a county fair and fallen in love, by her own later account. With the fact that he was the only man at the fair who was not trying to impress anybody, she said he just seemed like a man who already knew who he was. They were married for 22 years. The marriage was, by most accounts, a functional and largely quiet thing, not unhappy, not passionate in the way of movies, but steady and loyal in the way that real life sometimes is. Margaret gave Richard 2 children, a daughter named Susan, who now lives in Portland, Oregon, and wants nothing to do with this story, and a son named Daniel, born in 1985, who became, as sons of difficult men often do, the central contradiction of his father's life. Daniel Voss grew up inside the empire, and what that means is this: he grew up in a big house in a good school district. He wore clean clothes and went on family vacations to places like the Outer Banks and the Great Smoky Mountains, and he understood from a very young age that his father's name meant something in the world. But he also grew up watching what that name cost. He watched his father take phone calls at the dinner table and leave birthday parties early to handle emergencies that always had to do with business. He watched his mother learn to fill silences with small talk, and his sister learn to make herself quiet and agreeable. And Daniel, who was, by all accounts, a perceptive and emotionally intelligent boy, decided very early that he did not want what his father had. He did not want the empire. He wanted something smaller and truer, though for a long time he could not have told you exactly what that was. He was a reader. His teachers described him as one of those students who seemed to be thinking about something else, and not in the distracted way, but in the deep way, the way that makes teachers say, years later, "I always knew that one was going to do something." He played football for 2 years in high school, partly because Richard wanted him to, partly because he actually liked the physical contact and the clarity of a game with rules. But he quit at 16 to focus on art, specifically painting, which was either brave or foolish, depending on who you ask, and in the Voss household the answer was mostly the latter. Richard did not hide his disappointment. He never yelled about it because Richard Voss rarely yelled. He simply went quiet in the particular way that was, to everyone who knew him, far more devastating than volume. Daniel graduated from Rutgers University in 2007 with a degree in English literature and a minor in studio art. He had been offered a junior position at his father's firm, an offer that arrived in a sealed envelope in his dormitory mailbox during his junior year, which tells you something about how Richard Voss communicated. Daniel did not accept the offer. He sent a handwritten note back that said he was grateful but planned to find his own way. Richard filed the note without responding. Daniel moved to a small apartment in Hoboken, New Jersey, took a job at a bookstore, and began painting. He was 22 years old, and he was, for the first time in his life, completely free. And that freedom, real, chosen, daily freedom, was something his father never quite forgave him for, because it was the one thing Richard Voss had never allowed himself to have. For the next decade, Daniel's life moved at its own unhurried pace. He had a small circle of close friends. He dated carefully and without drama. He showed his paintings at small galleries in Hoboken and Brooklyn. Nothing spectacular, nothing that set the art world on fire, but genuine work that people who understood painting said had real feeling in it. He was, by every measure that the world outside his father's empire would use, a happy man, not wealthy, not famous, not ambitious in the way that gets written about, but genuinely, quietly happy in the way that some people manage to be when they escape the life that was planned for them and build the one they actually wanted. The trouble was that the life he had escaped had a long memory, and it was about to reach back for him. To understand what happened in the spring of 2016, the event that started the chain of decisions that would eventually lead Daniel Voss to live alone in his father's abandoned estate for 6 years, you need to understand a man named Marcus Holloway. Marcus Holloway was a real estate fund manager based out of Stamford, Connecticut, the kind of man who wore expensive suits and knew which restaurants had the right kind of booths and could make you feel, inside of 15 minutes of meeting him, like he was the most connected person in any room you'd ever been in. He was charming, he was smart. He was also, as federal investigators were quietly beginning to discover by 2015, moving money for people who very much did not want their money seen. Daniel had met Marcus Holloway through a mutual acquaintance in 2014. They were not close friends. Daniel later described the relationship as professional and occasional. But in 2015, when Holloway presented what looked like a straightforward real estate investment fund opportunity, Daniel had been talked into co-signing as a guarantor. He was told it was a formality. He was told his name on the paperwork was just a show of good faith to attract other investors. He was 30 years old. He was not a businessman by training or by inclination, and he trusted the person who introduced them. He signed. He thought nothing more of it, and for about a year he heard nothing more about it. Then, in early 2016, a mutual acquaintance called him to say that federal investigators had started making inquiries about Holloway's fund. And just like that, Daniel's quiet, paint-stained, bookstore-surrounded life had a shadow over it that he had not invited and did not know how to remove. The federal investigation into Marcus Holloway was real, methodical, and moving slowly in the way that serious financial investigations always do. By the spring of 2016, investigators had identified a list of individuals connected to the fund, people who had signed documents, attended meetings, whose names appeared on paperwork in ways that made them potentially useful as witnesses. Daniel Voss was on that list. He received a call from a federal investigator in April 2016 asking if he would be willing to come in for a conversation. He said he would think about it. He called a lawyer. The lawyer told him his exposure was minimal but real. And that cooperating would almost certainly eliminate whatever risk he faced. Daniel said he understood. He said he would decide soon. He did not call the federal investigator back, because in the weeks that followed, something happened that made the federal investigation seem, by comparison, like the smaller of his problems. In late September 2016, Daniel was approached in the parking garage beneath his apartment building. He told people close to him about this encounter afterward, not immediately, but eventually, in the way that people eventually tell the things that have frightened them most. Two men were waiting for him when he came off the elevator. They were polite. That was what he kept coming back to in the days afterward. How polite they were. They did not threaten him in the way of movies, with raised voices and physical intimidation. They spoke to him the way a financial advisor speaks to a client about risk management. They explained that testifying in any proceeding related to Marcus Holloway would create significant complications for people who were not accustomed to complications. They mentioned his father's business. They mentioned specific contracts that Voss Construction and Development had in New York and New Jersey, and then they wished him a good evening and got into a black SUV and drove away. Daniel went home and sat in his apartment for 2 days without calling anyone. He was not a man who frightened easily. His friends would tell you that consistently, but this was a different kind of fear from anything he had encountered before. This was not fear of a thing he could see and confront, and this was the fear of a system, a network of quiet arrangements and protected interests that existed entirely outside the reach of anything he knew how to do. He was not a fighter, not in that world. He was a painter who had co-signed a document as a favor and was now standing at the center of something that moved like weather, enormous, impersonal, and completely indifferent to who he was or what he wanted. He called his father on a Tuesday morning in October 2016. He drove to the corporate office in Morristown, New Jersey, waited in the lobby for 40 minutes while Richard finished a meeting, and then sat across from his father and told him everything. The fund, the federal investigation, the parking garage, the two men, what they had said, what they had mentioned. He told Richard everything, and Richard Harlan Voss, one of the most powerful men in the northeastern construction and real estate industry, a man who had negotiated with unions and city governments and federal regulators for 40 years, sat back in his chair, looked at his son, and said, according to Daniel's later account, 7 words. 7 words that Daniel would turn over in his mind for the next 6 years of his life, in the silence of the abandoned estate, in the pages of 14 handwritten journals, over and over until they were worn smooth like river stones. Richard said, "Handle it quietly. Don't embarrass this family." Let that sit for a moment. A son comes to his father, frightened, in genuine danger, asking for help. And the father's response is not, "I will protect you." It is not, "Let me call our attorneys." It is not even, "Tell me more." It is a command to be invisible. It is a directive to manage the inconvenience. Richard Voss would later say that he had not known the full extent of the threats, that he thought Daniel was describing a routine legal matter that required discretion and not emergency intervention. Whether you believe that depends on what you believe about Richard Voss as a man. And by the end of this story, you will have to decide that for yourself. Daniel left his father's office that afternoon and drove north on I-78 for a long time without any particular destination. At some point, he stopped at a rest area and sat in the parking lot until after dark. He thought about what his father had said. He thought about what the two men in the garage had said. He thought about the federal investigator's business card that was still sitting on his kitchen counter, uncalled, and he made a decision. Not the decision his father had suggested, not the quiet management of an embarrassing situation. He made a different decision entirely. He made the decision to disappear. The disappearance of Daniel Voss was reported to police on April 22, 2018, a year and a half after that meeting in his father's office. In that intervening period, Daniel had made his preparations quietly and carefully. He had maintained the surface of his life, continued going to the bookstore, continued painting, continued seeing his friends, while underneath it, almost invisibly, he had been getting ready to leave it. He had been withdrawing small amounts of cash over many months. He had been studying the estate in upstate New York, his father's abandoned property, the place no one visited, the place Richard had been trying and failing to sell. He had remembered the maintenance key he had kept since he was a teenager. He had visited the property twice at night, testing the water well, walking the east wing, measuring the greenhouse. On April 4th, 2018, Daniel Voss left his apartment in Hoboken, New Jersey, for the last time. He left most of his possessions where they were. He left his car at the train station in a spot where it would not be immediately noticed. He had arranged for someone to see him near the station that morning. Not a conspiracy, just a casual interaction that he knew would later confuse the timeline. He withdrew $600 in cash from a bank teller, not an ATM, which could be tracked more easily, and he took a bus north to a town 30 miles from the Voss Estate. He walked the last 2 miles after dark. He used the maintenance key. He pushed open the side door of the east wing, and he was inside, and the door closed behind him. And that was the last time the world, for 6 years, knew where Daniel Voss was. Police investigated his disappearance for 8 weeks. They spoke to his friends, his landlord, his doctor, his former colleagues. They reviewed his bank records and his phone history. They found the car at the train station. They found no evidence of foul play. What they could not find, and what they eventually stopped looking for, as investigations of this kind eventually do, was any sign of where Daniel had gone or why. The official finding, issued in the summer of 2018, concluded that Daniel Voss had most likely taken his own life by entering the Hudson River near the station. The body, it was noted, had not been recovered, which the report attributed to the currents and the depth of the river in that area. A memorial service was held in September of 2018. Richard Voss attended. He sat in the front row and he did not cry. The people who were there said he looked not like a man in grief, but like a man doing the arithmetic of something he could not solve. What Daniel Voss built inside that abandoned estate over 6 years was, in a word that does not fully capture it, a life. Not a spectacular life. Not a comfortable life by the standards of the world he had come from, but a deliberate one. A life assembled piece by piece from what was available, structured around routines that kept him sane and hidden, and, in ways that took him a long time to understand, genuinely at peace with himself, in a way he had never quite been before. This is one of the stranger truths at the center of this story, and it is worth sitting with. A man who vanished from the world in order to survive it, and who found, inside the silence, something he had been looking for his entire life without knowing its name. The east wing of the Voss Estate was the most structurally sound part of the property. Richard had built the house in phases, beginning with the main hall and the west wing, and the east wing, which contained 4 bedrooms, a sitting room, and access to the greenhouse had been completed last in 1998 with better materials than the earlier construction. The roof held. The windows, though dirty, were not broken. The plumbing was non-functional, as the pipes had been winterized when the estate was closed, but the old stone well at the back of the property still produced clean water when Daniel lowered the hand-crank bucket he found in the maintenance shed. He boiled everything in the first months, then stopped when he realized the well was producing better water than anything he had ever bought in a plastic bottle in Hoboken. He heated the east wing using the fireplace in the main sitting room, carefully and only at night, burning wood. He cut from the deadfall in the back acreage where the smoke would disperse across a broad tree canopy and not be visible from the road. He kept the fire small. He kept the lights off on the road-facing side of the wing at all times. He wore dark clothing when he moved around the property after sunset. He was not paranoid. That word implies an irrationality that did not apply here. He was careful. He was systematic. He was applying to the problem of his own survival the same focused discipline that his father had always applied to business, which is perhaps the most Richard Voss thing about Daniel Voss, that when he finally had to be strategic, he was very good at it. The greenhouse became the center of his days. It was overgrown when he arrived. The glass panels still intact, but thick with algae and years of unattended plant matter. He cleared it over the first 2 months, salvaging the structural beds, testing the soil, ordering seeds from catalogs he requested under a neighbor's name at a post office box in a small town 30 miles away. By his second summer, he had tomatoes, squash, beans, herbs, and a row of sunflowers along the south wall that served no practical purpose except to remind him that beauty was still possible in a life reduced to its bare essentials. He ate simply. He ate well. He lost weight in the first year, and then stabilized. His hands became rough and capable in the way of people who work with them constantly. Once a week, in the hours before dawn, Daniel would make the drive into one of several small towns in a 30-mile radius. Always a different town, always alternating the route. Always using one of 3 unremarkable vehicles he had acquired over the first year through private cash sales listed in the classified sections of local newspapers. He bought supplies at grocery stores and hardware shops, paying always in cash, wearing ordinary clothes, a baseball cap, a flannel shirt, work boots that looked like they had seen some use. He was not in disguise. He was simply unremarkable. He had studied, in his previous life, how to become invisible in a social environment, and the answer that nobody who has not tried it fully appreciates, is not to look different. It is to look exactly like everyone else. Nobody reported anything suspicious about a quiet man in a baseball cap buying flour and dried beans and hardware supplies in rural upstate New York. In 6 years, nobody reported anything at all. He read. This is a detail that says something important about who Daniel Voss was as a person, and it is a detail that should not be skipped over. He had brought very few possessions into the estate with him: a duffel bag of clothing, some basic tools, a small amount of cash, and a backpack containing 9 books. 9 books, chosen carefully, because he did not know yet how long he would be there or how long they would need to last. Over the following months and years, he built a library from used bookshops in the towns he visited, paperbacks, purchased a few at a time, transported back to the estate, read slowly and with the full attention of a man who has nothing else to interrupt him. By the end of his 6 years there, he had over 400 books stacked in the sitting room of the East Wing. 14 of those volumes were the journals he had written himself. The journals. This is where the story gets complicated and rich and painful in ways that take a long time to fully process. Daniel Voss filled 14 composition notebooks over 6 years. He wrote about his childhood. He wrote about his father. He wrote about the morning he sat across from Richard in the Morristown office and heard those 7 words, He wrote about Marcus Holloway and the parking garage, and the two polite men who had spoken to him about risk management while standing next to his car. He wrote about the federal investigation and what he had watched it eventually produce. Following the news through a prepaid tablet, he kept carefully updated at the library in one of the towns he visited monthly. He wrote about justice and whether it was real. He wrote about forgiveness and whether it was possible. And he wrote, over and over in the middle sections of almost every journal, about the question he could not answer, whether his father had known and had chosen, or had simply failed to understand, and which of those was worse. Because here is the thing about those 6 years that takes your breath away when you sit with it. Richard Voss was not passive. He was not an old man quietly grieving in a corner office, unaware of the world around him. He was building new acquisitions in 2019. He was involved in a high-profile political contribution controversy in 2020 that he survived through aggressive legal management. He remarried in 2021, a woman named Patricia Ellers, who lasted 14 months before the marriage ended by mutual agreement. He was sharp. He was active. He was, by every external measure, a man operating at full capacity, and 3 documented times, his personal driver's logs show that Richard Harlan Voss was driven to within 2 miles of the Voss Estate and turned back without entering. The first time was November 2019. The second was March 2021. The third was July 2023. 3 times he came close enough to see the front gate. 3 times he turned back. And no one, not his assistant, not his attorney, not Patricia Ellers, has ever heard him explain why. There was one other person who came close to knowing. In the autumn of 2022, a plumber named Joe Trent was dispatched by the county to assess stormwater damage to the property's drainage system. He let himself in through the front gate, which was, inexplicably, unlocked. Daniel had forgotten to replace the padlock after a supply run and did not realize it for 3 days. Joe Trent walked the outer grounds, made his assessment, and at one point entered the east wing through the unlocked side door to check the interior drainage pipes. He was in the wing for approximately 12 minutes. He found what he later described as evidence that someone had been living there. Boot prints in the dust, a fresh smell beneath the staleness, what looked like a recently extinguished candle. He filed a report with the county. The report was logged and reviewed. The estate was private property. The county took no action. Joe Trent mentioned what he had seen to 2 people. One of them, and this matters, worked in the property management division of a company that held several Voss construction contracts. That report never reached Richard's desk, or so Richard has said. October 11th, 2024, a Friday. The kind of upstate New York October day that reminds you why people who have choices decide to live in that part of the world. Cold enough for a jacket, the maples at full color, the light coming in at an angle that makes everything look like it is being remembered rather than experienced. Richard Voss had been in Albany for a land acquisition meeting that had taken 2 days longer than anticipated. He was tired. He was in the back seat of his car, looking at his phone, when his driver, a man named Phil Garrett, who had worked for Richard for 11 years, took the back road to avoid the construction backup on the main highway. The back road runs along the northern boundary of the Voss Estate property. Richard looked up from his phone and recognized where he was before he consciously understood why. It was a physical recognition, something in his body before his mind. He told Phil to stop. Phil pulled over on the gravel shoulder. Richard sat in the stopped car for a moment, looking at the iron gate at the end of the lane. The same gate he had locked for the last time 6 years ago. The same gate he had driven past 3 times without stopping, in November 2019, in March 2021, in July 2023. He got out of the car. Phil asked if everything was all right. Richard said he would just be a few minutes. He walked through the leaves on the lane with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on the house at the far end, and he felt the particular weight of a place that has held the most important parts of your life and been abandoned by you, which is a weight unlike any other weight there is. He saw the shape in the window when he was about 40 yards from the house. Second floor, east wing. He stopped walking. The shape did not move for a moment. Then it did. A slow, deliberate step backward, as if whoever was there had realized they had been seen. Richard stood completely still in the driveway. He had been in enough high-pressure situations in his professional life to know that the thing you do in the moment of shock is not make a move. You hold still. You let your mind catch up to your eyes. He held still. He looked at the window. He thought about what his mind was telling him. He dismissed it twice. He stood there for 30 seconds that he later described as the longest 30 seconds of his life. And then he ran, not away, toward. This is the detail that the people who know Richard Voss best say is the most Richard Voss thing about the entire story. He did not call the police. He did not call his attorney. He did not stand at the gate and shout. He picked up a flat-faced rock from the border of the old rosebed, broke the lock on the side door of the east wing, and walked into the house he had built with his own money and his own decisions and his own particular brand of iron-willed ambition, calling his dead son's name into the dark. He was 71 years old. He was wearing a $2,000 overcoat. He was alone. And he was calling into the darkness of the hallway, "Daniel. Daniel," his voice cracking on the second syllable in a way that his voice had never cracked in 40 years of business, in every difficult room he had ever sat in. Daniel came down the stairs. He appeared at the top of the staircase, and he stood there for a moment, looking down at his father. He was 39 years old. He was thinner than he had been in 2018. He had a beard he had not had before, going gray at the jaw. He was wearing a canvas workshirt and heavy canvas trousers and boots that had seen 6 years of actual work. He looked, this is how people who have heard the account describe it, like a man who has been living in the world, not hiding from it. There was no fear in his face. There was something more complex than fear. There was the particular expression of a person who has been rehearsing a moment in their mind for years and is now watching it actually arrive, and finding that the real thing is both exactly what they imagined and nothing like it at all. Richard crossed the ballroom floor. He walked under the dusty chandelier, past the shrouded furniture, across the parquet that had not been walked on in years. He crossed the distance between himself and his son. And then Richard Harlan Voss, the man who had not cried at his son's memorial service, the man who had built an empire by never showing weakness, the man who had responded to his son's fear with a command to handle it quietly, put his arms around Daniel and held on. He did not speak for a long time. The only sound in that room, in that house, in that October afternoon, was the wind through the old window frames and the sound of a father breathing in the fact of his son being alive. When Richard finally spoke, Daniel later said, he did not ask where Daniel had been. He did not ask why. He did not say, "I thought you were dead," or "I missed you," or "I am sorry," or any of the things that a moment like that is supposed to contain. He said 4 words, "Tell me everything." And Daniel looked at his father for a long moment, at this man who had built him and failed him and grieved him and, as it would shortly emerge, possibly known far more about his survival than he had ever admitted. And Daniel said the words that had been living in him for 6 years. He said, "Dad, I hid because of you." There are moments in a story where the ground shifts. where something you thought you understood turns out to have been built on a foundation you never examined, and the moment you look at the foundation, the whole structure has to be reconsidered. The moment Daniel said those words to his father, "I hid because of you," was that moment. And everything that follows in this segment is the unpacking of what those words actually meant, because they did not mean simply what they appeared to mean on the surface. They meant something older and more complicated and far more painful than any simple accusation. In that ballroom, over the next 3 hours, as the October light faded through the dirty windows and the cold deepened in the unheated rooms, Daniel told his father everything. He told him about Marcus Holloway and the fund and the co-signature. He told him about the federal investigation and the investigator's business card and the weeks he had spent in paralysis trying to decide what to do. He told him about the parking garage and the 2 men who had been so polite and so specific about the risks of testifying. He told him that the men in the garage had mentioned Voss construction contracts by name. He told him that after leaving the garage, he had sat in his apartment for 2 days and then called his father, hoping, the word Daniel used later was hoping, that his father would tell him something that made the fear go away. And instead his father had told him to handle it quietly. Richard listened. He did not interrupt. This is something that Daniel noted specifically when he later described the conversation. His father listened without interrupting, which was not a thing Richard Voss did in professional settings, where interruption was a tool. But in that ballroom, in the fading light, Richard sat on an overturned crate that Daniel brought from the greenhouse, and he listened to every word. And when Daniel finished, and Richard said something that Daniel had not expected, he said, "I didn't know they had threatened your life. I thought you needed to disappear for a few weeks. I told you to handle it quietly because I thought that's all it required." And Daniel looked at his father and said, "But you knew who those men worked for. You knew what kind of people they were. You've done business in that world for 30 years. How could you not know what handle it quietly meant to people like that?" This is the question at the absolute center of this story. It is the question that Richard Voss has never fully answered in any forum, not to the federal investigators who later questioned him, not to his attorneys, not to the journalists who have tried to report on this case, and apparently not to Daniel in that ballroom, at least not to Daniel's satisfaction. The question is not whether Richard knew the men had physically threatened Daniel. Richard says he did not know that. Let's assume for a moment that's true. The question is deeper. It is, when Richard had spent 40 years building an empire in an industry that routinely intersects with the kind of money and the kind of people that Marcus Holloway was connected to, when he had built enough to know how those intersections worked and what they required, and when his son came to him frightened and told him about men in a parking garage, how much did Richard Voss actually understand about what was happening? And how much did he choose not to understand? Because here is what the federal investigation ultimately revealed, and it revealed this only in 2023, after Holloway and several associates were convicted, and after investigators spent years piecing together the financial architecture of the scheme. Marcus Holloway's fund had, at various points between 2013 and 2017, moved money on behalf of a network of individuals with connections to organized financial crime along the eastern seaboard. Several of those individuals had also been counterparties in transactions with Voss Construction and Development, not in any way that was ever charged as criminal. Not in any way that pointed to Richard Voss having direct knowledge of the money laundering, but in a way that established clearly and documentably that Richard Voss's professional world and Marcus Holloway's professional world had overlapped repeatedly for years. They were not strangers to the same ecosystem. The 2 men in the garage who had spoken to Daniel, their names appeared in the federal investigation. They had connections to entities that had also done business with Voss affiliates. Richard Voss knew this world. He lived adjacent to it. Whether he chose not to see it or genuinely did not see it is a question that his behavior in the years that followed does nothing to clarify. Daniel stayed in the estate because he was afraid. That is the simple version. But the deeper version, the version that the journals tell, is more nuanced than fear. By the end of his first year in the estate, Daniel was no longer afraid in the immediate physical sense. The federal investigation had progressed. Holloway's organization was fracturing. The two men from the garage had moved on to other problems. The threat, such as it had been, was fading. And yet Daniel did not emerge. He did not contact anyone. He did not call the federal investigators whose business card had long since turned yellow on his old kitchen counter. He stayed, and the reason he stayed, the reason he wrote about obsessively in those 14 journals, was not fear of the men in the garage. It was something that took him years of silence and solitude to name. He stayed because he could not figure out how to go back to a world that required him to pretend the conversation in his father's office had not happened. He could not go back to being Richard Voss's son in the way that the world expected him to be Richard Voss's son. Loyal, presentable, the continuation of an empire he had never wanted. Now that he knew, with the clarity of a man who has sat alone with the truth for long enough, that when it had mattered most, his father had chosen the empire over him. The 14 journals document this reckoning with an honesty that is difficult to read and impossible to dismiss. In the third journal, written during the winter of his second year in the estate, Daniel writes about his father in a passage that has been described by those who have seen it as the most precise thing he ever put on paper. He writes about Richard as a man who loved his son in the only way he knew how, which was to provide for him, to protect the structure of the world around him, to ensure that the name and the reputation and the empire remained intact, and who had never understood, and perhaps could not understand, that what Daniel had needed from him was not any of those things. What Daniel had needed was to be chosen, not the empire, not the business, not the name, just Daniel, just once, in a moment that cost something real, to be chosen first. He writes, "My father told me to handle it quietly. I have spent 2 years trying to decide whether he said that because he didn't know how serious it was, or because he did know, and the instinct to protect the business was faster than the instinct to protect me. I don't know which answer is worse. If he didn't know, then the man I most needed to understand my world did not understand it, and I was alone in a way I hadn't known I was alone. If he did know, even partially, even at the edges, then I was expendable, and an expendable son is a particular kind of orphan that nobody has a name for." He wrote that in the winter of his second year. He had 4 more years ahead of him. He spent them, among other things, trying to decide whether he would ever be able to forgive a man he was not sure had done anything that could technically be called wrong. Back in the world, Richard Voss was not idle. This is important to say clearly because one version of this story would have Richard as a broken, grieving father spending 6 years haunted by loss, and while there is evidence of haunting, there is more evidence of a man doing what he had always done, functioning at high capacity while keeping the emotional part of himself entirely separate from everything else. He made acquisitions. He survived the political controversy. He remarried. He drove 3 times to within 2 miles of the estate and turned back. He did not hire investigators to look into Daniel's disappearance independently. He did not contact any of Daniel's friends. He did not revisit the official finding of the case. He accepted, publicly and apparently privately, that Daniel was gone, and he moved forward. Because that was what Richard Voss did. He moved forward. The question that the people who know him best cannot agree on is whether moving forward, in this case, was how he grieved or how he hid. The story of what happened after that October afternoon in the Voss Estate ballroom is, in some ways, the most complicated part of everything we have told you so far. Because what followed was not simple. It was not a clean resolution. It was not the kind of ending that allows everyone to exhale and go home feeling that the world makes sense. What followed was a long, tangled, deeply human process of reckoning, legal, personal, and emotional, that is still, as of the making of this documentary, not finished. Some chapters have closed, others remain stubbornly, painfully open. The first consequence was legal, and it arrived quickly. Richard's attorney, a man named Gerald Price, who had handled Voss family legal matters for 23 years, was contacted by Richard within 24 hours of the confrontation at the estate. Not about the confrontation itself, not yet, but about something Richard apparently needed to address before anything else. What Gerald Price was asked to do in that first phone call has not been made fully public, but what we know from subsequent legal filings is that within 72 hours of Richard's visit to the estate, 3 separate communications were sent from Price's office to federal agencies that were, at the time, in the final stages of building their case against the Holloway network. The nature of those communications has not been disclosed. What is known is that within 2 weeks, a federal investigator contacted Daniel Voss directly at the estate, apparently having been told where to find him. The federal investigation into the Holloway network was, by October 2024, 6 years further along than it had been when Daniel disappeared. Marcus Holloway himself had been arrested in 2022 on the first wave of charges. Several of his associates had either been convicted, pleaded guilty, or were cooperating with prosecutors. The 2 men from the parking garage, whose names we are not using in this documentary for legal reasons still pending, had been charged in 2023 as part of a broader witness intimidation and financial fraud case. And the federal investigators who contacted Daniel in November 2024 were not starting from scratch. They were closing threads, and Daniel's testimony, his direct first-hand account of the conversation in the garage, delivered now, with 6 years of careful observation and 14 journals of documentation behind it, was, in the words of a legal source familiar with the case, more valuable than anyone expected it to be 6 years later, because he had been watching from the outside the whole time and he had written down everything. Daniel cooperated fully with federal investigators. He turned over the journals. He gave a detailed account of the parking garage encounter, the timeline of his decision to disappear, and the 6 years in the estate. He was not charged with any crime related to his disappearance. There is no law against leaving your own life, even under the circumstances he created. The question of whether he had engaged in any form of fraud by faking his death was examined and not pursued, partly because the official finding had never been a formal death certificate. It had been a determination of presumed death, which is a subtly but legally meaningfully different thing. Daniel's attorneys navigated this carefully, and the outcome was that Daniel emerged from federal cooperation as a witness, not a defendant. Richard Voss was questioned, at length. On 4 separate occasions over a period of 3 months, Richard and his attorneys met with federal investigators to discuss his knowledge of the Holloway network, his business relationships with entities that had intersected with Holloway's operations, and, most directly, the conversation he had with Daniel in the Morristown office in October 2016. What Richard told those investigators is protected by the confidentiality of that process and has not been made public in full. What became public, through the filing of related court documents, is that Richard was asked whether he had known, at any point prior to October 2024, that Daniel was alive and living in the estate. Richard's documented response to that question was, I had suspicions that I chose not to pursue. That sentence? 8 words, delivered by Richard Voss through his attorney's statement to the investigating committee, became, when it was eventually reported, the most discussed and most damning sentence in the entire story. Suspicions that I chose not to pursue. Let us examine that sentence. A man loses his son. He holds a memorial service. He accepts a finding of presumed death. He moves forward with his life, business, a new marriage, acquisitions, political controversies, all the apparatus of a powerful man in full operation. And 3 times he drives to within 2 miles of the estate where his son is living and turns back without entering. And when asked whether he knew his son was alive, he says he had suspicions he chose not to pursue. There are a limited number of ways to interpret this. Either Richard Voss suspected his son was alive, possibly in the estate, and chose not to confirm it because doing so would require a confrontation he was not ready for, or he suspected his son was alive, possibly in the estate, and chose not to confirm it because confirming it would open questions about the Morristown conversation and the parking garage and the Holloway network that he was not prepared to answer. Or both of those things were true at once, which is the most human explanation and the one that is, by far, the hardest to sit with. The public response, when the story broke in late November 2024, first through a local upstate New York news outlet, then nationally within 48 hours, was immediate and divided along lines that tell you a great deal about what different Americans believe about family, about power, and about what powerful men owe the people who depend on them. Half the coverage focused on Richard Voss as a villain in an expensive overcoat, a cold, calculating man who had let his son live in an abandoned house for 6 years rather than face a conversation that might have cost him something. The other half focused on Daniel as an adult who had made his own choices. A man in his 30s who had chosen to disappear, had refused to seek help, had stayed in hiding long past any reasonable threat period, and had now surfaced to complicate everyone's life with 6 years of absence and a stack of journals. Both narratives were used. Both narratives missed the point. The point, the thing that gets lost in the noise of public narrative, is that this was not a story about a villain and a victim. This was a story about 2 men in a relationship that had never fully worked, failing each other in the specific ways that the particular shapes of their personalities made inevitable, and then spending 6 years in different kinds of silence before a chance trip down a back road brought them face to face with everything they had never said. Richard Voss was not a monster. He was a man who had learned from the earliest days of his life that vulnerability was a liability and that the answer to every problem was forward motion. Daniel Voss was not a saint. He was a man who had chosen, at a point of genuine fear, the most extreme available option, and then stayed in that extreme option long past the point of necessity, in part because the alternative required him to forgive something he was not sure he could forgive. Marcus Holloway was convicted in a federal court in Connecticut in March 2023 on multiple counts of money laundering and wire fraud. He was sentenced to 11 years and served the first 2 at a federal correctional institution in New England before his attorneys filed an appeal that is still, as of this writing, pending in the Second Circuit. 2 of his associates received reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation. The 2 men who had spoken to Daniel in the parking garage in September 2016 were charged as part of the broader case in 2023. One pleaded guilty and received 3 years. The other went to trial in early 2024 and was convicted on both counts of witness intimidation and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 7 years. Daniel Voss sat in the gallery for the second day of that trial. He did not testify in person. His written account had been entered into evidence. He sat in the back of the gallery and he watched the verdict being read. People who were in the courtroom that day said he did not appear satisfied. He appeared, they said, like a man checking something off a list that had never been the real list to begin with. The Voss Estate was not sold. Richard had made a quiet decision, communicated through Gerald Price, not announced publicly, that the property would be restored rather than liquidated. Over the 14 months following the October 2024 reunion, a small crew of contractors, none from Voss Construction, notably, but a family firm from the next county over, worked through the main house and the east wing, repairing the roof, replacing the windows, restoring the plumbing and heating systems. The greenhouse was not touched. Daniel had asked, through intermediaries, that the greenhouse be left exactly as he had kept it. It was. The tomato plants he had maintained that last summer were dead by November, naturally, but the beds were intact. The hand-labeled herb pots were in their places on the southern bench, and the folding chair Daniel had kept in the corner, facing the east-facing window, a chair that looked out over nothing but a field of old grass and the tree line beyond it, remained exactly where he had left it. There is one more piece of this story. It is the piece that changes the geometry of everything that came before it, and it came to light not through the federal investigation, not through any legal proceeding, but through a disclosure that Richard Voss made voluntarily, to his attorney, to Daniel, and eventually, in a limited and carefully worded statement, to the investigators reviewing the broader case. It is the piece that takes the entire question of what Richard knew and when he knew it and replaces it with a harder and more personal question. What Richard felt and what he chose to do with those feelings, and whether the distinction between knowledge and feeling matters when you are talking about a father and a son. In the weeks following the October 2024 reunion, while Daniel was cooperating with federal investigators and Richard was being questioned by his own team of attorneys, a document was discovered in Richard's private files at his residential office in Morristown, New Jersey. Not discovered by investigators, discovered by Richard himself, who appears to have gone looking for it deliberately and then turned it over voluntarily. It was a letter. 4 pages, handwritten in Richard's characteristically precise, controlled script, on Voss Construction letterhead with the letterhead crossed out and the header replaced with a simple date. The date was October 14th, 2019. 18 months after Daniel's official disappearance. A year after the memorial service. A year and 4 months after Richard had walked out of the sealed estate for the last time, or what he had thought was the last time. The letter was addressed to Daniel. It began with a sentence so direct, so stripped of the protective language Richard normally used, that the people who have read it, a limited number, including Daniel, Gerald Price, and the federal investigators who were eventually given access to it, have universally described it as the most honest thing Richard Voss had ever put on paper in his life. The sentence was, "I think I know where you are. I think I have known for some time, and I need you to understand why I have not come." The letter then runs for 4 pages. It is, by all accounts, a reckoning. Not a confession. Richard was too careful a man for unqualified confession, but a reckoning with what he had done and had not done, with what he had known and had chosen not to act on, with what he believed about his son's safety and his son's choices and the impossible arithmetic of a father who suspected his child was alive and could not bring himself to cross the distance between them. He wrote that he believed Daniel had chosen to disappear, that the disappearance had been deliberate and planned, not a crisis. He wrote that believing this had made it possible for him, in the first year, to carry the grief without being destroyed by it, because grief for a son who chose to leave is a different weight from grief for a son who was taken. He wrote that by the end of the first year, he had begun to suspect that the estate was where Daniel had gone, not from any direct evidence, but from a feeling he could not name and could not dismiss, a pull toward the property that he could not fully explain even to himself. He wrote that he had driven to within sight of the front gate 3 times in the years that followed, and that each time he had turned back. He wrote, "The truth is, I was afraid, not of what I would find, of what I would owe if I found it, because if you were there, then I had to answer for October 2016, and I have spent 3 years deciding whether I can." The letter was never sent. Richard Voss kept it in a locked drawer in his private office for 5 years. He did not write a second one. He did not try to contact Daniel by any other means. He simply kept the letter and drove to the estate and turned back, and kept the letter and moved forward in the world in the way that Richard Voss had always moved forward, by putting one foot in front of the other and not looking too long at the things that lived in the peripheral vision of his conscience. Whether this was cowardice is a judgment that belongs to whoever is reading this. What it was, without question, was human, painfully, recognizably, achingly human, in the way that the most difficult things people do to each other almost always are. When Daniel was shown the letter, in the weeks after the reunion, after the federal cooperation had begun, and after the first raw confrontations in the estate had given way to the longer, slower work of 2 people figuring out what it meant to be in each other's presence again, he read it 3 times without speaking. His attorney was present. Richard's attorney was present. No one spoke during the reading. When Daniel finished, he looked up and he asked if he could keep it. Richard said yes. And that was, by all available accounts, the entirety of the exchange in that moment. No shouting, no tears, no immediate forgiveness or refusal of it. Just a son reading a letter that his father had written and never sent, and deciding, silently, privately, in the way that the deepest decisions are always made, what to do with what it contained. The letter, when the outline of its contents eventually became known through sources close to the family, did not resolve the public debate about Richard Voss. If anything, it intensified it, because the letter confirmed what the 3 return trips to the estate had suggested, that Richard had known or strongly believed that his son was alive and had chosen not to act on that knowledge. The people who already believed Richard was primarily a man protecting his interests saw the letter as confirmation. The people who wanted to believe Richard was a grieving father who had simply failed his son saw in the letter something more forgivable. A man who had been afraid, who had admitted being afraid, who had written the admission down and carried it for 5 years, and then, when the moment finally came, had handed it over. Neither reading is wrong. Both readings are incomplete, because Richard Voss is not a character in a story. He is a person. And people are not reducible to the worst or the best of what they have done. We have spent the last 2 hours with Richard and Daniel Voss. We have followed the arc of a relationship from a steel worker's son building an empire in Pennsylvania to an October afternoon in upstate New York, when that empire's cost was finally named out loud by the person who had paid the most of it. We have walked through the fear and the silence and the parking garage and the abandoned greenhouse and the 14 journals and the letter that was written and never sent. And now we have to ask the question that all of it was building toward. Not a legal question, not a factual question, but the question that will stay with you after you close this video and go back to your own life. What does this story mean? Not as a news item, not as a crime documentary. As a story about people. As a story about the specific, recurring, heartbreaking human failure that it documents. Because here is the thing. This is not a story about a billionaire and a fugitive and a federal investigation. Those are the facts of the story. But the story itself, the thing underneath the facts, the thing that is actually happening, is a story about what fathers do to sons when they have been taught, by a world that rewards it, to prioritize position over people, And it is a story about what sons do when they discover that the person they most needed to be chosen by, the person whose choice would have made the most difference, chose something else instead. Richard Voss did not set out to fail his son. He set out to build something lasting. He told himself, the way that men of his generation and his particular brand of ambition tell themselves, that the empire was for the family, that the sacrifices were for Daniel, that the hard choices and the quiet management of inconvenient things were the price of the security that Daniel had grown up inside. And in a narrow technical sense, some of that was true. The school and the house and the vacations and the name on the mailbox. Those were real things that Richard built. But a man can provide everything for a son and still leave him fundamentally alone. And Daniel Voss was, in the way that matters most, a fundamentally alone child inside a very well-provided life. And the moment that aloneness was tested, the moment it required his father to choose between the empire and him, the test produced its answer in 7 words. Handle it quietly. Don't embarrass this family. 7 words that a father said to a son who needed something different. 7 words that sent a man into 6 years of voluntary exile, not because of the men in the parking garage, but because of the realization those men had crystallized, that the person he most needed to trust had shown, in the moment that mattered, where his deepest loyalty lived. And it did not live with Daniel. It lived with the empire, and the name, and the business, and the forward motion that had been Richard Voss's answer to every difficulty since his father died when Richard was 19 years old, and he went back to work the next morning, because what else was there to do? The hard, uncomfortable truth of this story is that Richard Voss is not an anomaly. He is a recognizable type. And he is the man that a certain kind of American ambition produces. A man who builds something real and lasting and impressive, and who does it partly out of love for his family and partly out of a terror of vulnerability that he has never examined and does not know how to name. A man who confuses provision with presence, who confuses protection with control, who, when a son comes to him frightened, reaches not for his son, but for the management strategy that has worked on every other problem he has ever faced, and does not understand until it is very late that some things cannot be managed. Some things require you to put down the strategy and simply stand there, in the open, with your son, and choose. There is a reconciliation of some kind between Richard and Daniel Voss. It is incomplete and ongoing, which is the only honest way to describe what happens between two people after something like this. Daniel attended Richard's 72nd birthday gathering in January 2025. He stayed for 4 hours. He left without making a public statement. Richard has not spoken publicly about the reunion beyond the formal legal disclosures his attorneys have managed. Daniel gave one interview to an independent documentary filmmaker who has not yet released the full footage, in which he said something that has stayed with everyone who has heard it. He said, "I don't know if I was hiding from my father's enemies or from my father. After a while I couldn't tell the difference. The danger and the disappointment had the same address." The danger and the disappointment had the same address. Sit with that for a moment, because that sentence tells you everything you need to know about what it cost Daniel Voss to be Richard Voss's son. And Richard, who has said very little publicly about any of this, who has let his attorneys speak for him, and has returned to his business and to the forward motion that defines him. Richard gave one answer in one setting that has also stayed with the people who heard it. He was asked by one of the federal investigators reviewing his testimony why he had driven to the estate 3 times and turned back. And Richard Voss, a man who had answered hard questions in boardrooms and courtrooms and federal offices for 40 years, was quiet for a long moment. And then he said, Because I was afraid he wouldn't want me to come in. Not afraid of what he would find, afraid that his son, living alone in the house Richard had abandoned, had found something in that solitude that was better than his father, and that Richard would knock on the door and Daniel would look at him and the answer would be, no, not yet, maybe not ever. And Richard Voss, who was afraid of very little, was afraid of that. The Voss Estate has been restored. It stands today, clean and maintained, in upstate New York. The greenhouse is intact. The folding chair faces the window. Whether Daniel has been back to it since leaving in October, the 2024, is not publicly known. Whether Richard goes there is not publicly known. What is known is that the gate is no longer rusted. Someone oiled the hinges. Someone replaced the padlock with a new one. And if you drove past it on that back road, the road that Richard's driver took on October 11th, and 2024 to avoid the construction on Route 9, you would see a house that looks, from the outside, like a house where someone lives. Or perhaps like a house that is being kept ready for someone who might, one day, be ready to come back. Richard Voss wrote a letter to his son that he never sent. He drove to the estate 3 times and turned back. He knew, or believed he knew, and he waited. He told himself that waiting was a form of love, that giving Daniel the space to come out on his own terms was the most he could offer, that showing up uninvited, forcing the confrontation, breaking down the door, would drive his son further away. And maybe he was right. Maybe Daniel, had his father arrived in 2020 or 2021, would have walked out the other side of the estate and been gone before Richard reached the porch. Maybe the waiting was the only form of love available to a man who had spent a lifetime learning to love through provision and distance. Or maybe Richard was simply afraid of what it would cost him to be chosen second, afraid that his son, in 6 years of silence, had decided the answer was no. We cannot answer that for you. We cannot tell you whether Richard Voss is a man who failed his son catastrophically and spent years managing the evidence of that failure, or whether he is a man who loved his son in the only broken way he knew how and paid for it in a grief that nobody who was not inside his chest could ever fully measure. We suspect the truth is that he is both. We suspect that most of the people in your life, and most of the choices you have made, are also both. The line between love and its failures is not always a line. Sometimes it is the same act seen from 2 different sides of the same wall. So here is the question we leave you with tonight. Not a legal question, not a question about what Richard Voss should have done, or what the federal investigators should have found, or what the right sentence was for the men who stood in a parking garage and spoke politely about risk management to a frightened young man. Those questions have answers, or partial answers, or answers that are still being worked out in appellate courts. The question we leave you with is the one that Richard Voss himself had to answer on the back road on October 11th, 2024, when his driver slowed the car and Richard saw the gate and got out. The question he had been avoiding for years. The question that every one of us will eventually have to answer about someone we have hurt or failed or left in a silence we were afraid to break. The question is simply this. If you knew, truly knew, that someone you loved was hiding from you, would you wait for them to come out on their own? Or would you break down the door? Drop your answer in the comments. We genuinely read them, and the debate this story starts in comment sections, we promise you, does not end quickly. If this documentary reached you, if it made you feel something or think something or remember something, subscribe to this channel. We make these documentaries for people who want the whole truth, not just the headline, and the next story is already waiting. Thank you for staying with Richard and Daniel Voss to the very end.